The Echoes in the Abandoned Station by Irwin Montrose. Chapter 1. Into the Veil of Rust. The rusted rails stretched into the fog like twin scars across the earth, their surfaces slick with October rain that had been falling since dusk. I adjusted my headlamp and checked my equipment one final time. Digital recorder, EMF detector, thermal camera, all the tools modern ghost hunters swear by, though I'd never considered myself one of them. Not until tonight. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm a folklore researcher at the university. What brought me to Millbrook Station at 11:30 on a Tuesday night wasn't academic curiosity. It was the phone call I'd received 3 days ago from a woman whose voice shook with barely contained terror.
Professor Chen, you don't know me, but I found your paper on railway folklore online. I need to tell someone what I saw at the old station, what I heard. They won't believe me at the police station, but maybe you will.
Her name was Rebecca Martinez, and she'd been photographing abandoned buildings for her art portfolio when she stumbled upon Millbrook Station. What she described in our 40-minute conversation defied rational explanation. Voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, the sound of a train that never came, and most disturbing of all, the sensation that something was trying to communicate with her. The platform emerged from the mist like a ghost ship, its Victorian-era ironwork still elegant despite decades of neglect. Millbrook Station had been abandoned since 1962, when the railway company rerouted the main line through the valley. The official records were sparse: budget cuts, declining ridership, the usual bureaucratic explanations. But the unofficial stories ran much deeper.
I'd spent the last 3 days in the university archives, piecing together fragments of local history that painted a far more sinister picture. The station's final years had been marked by a series of unexplained incidents. A signalman named Thomas Hartwell, who vanished from his post in 1959, leaving behind only his pocket watch and a logbook filled with increasingly erratic entries about voices in the tunnel. A young girl named Emily Foster, who disappeared from the platform in 1961 while waiting for the evening train. Witnesses claimed they saw her boarding a carriage, but the train manifest showed no record of her ticket.
And then there was the sealed tunnel. The eastern platform ended abruptly at a brick wall that looked decades newer than the rest of the structure. According to the maintenance records I'd found, the tunnel had been sealed for structural safety reasons just 3 months before the station's closure. But Rebecca had mentioned hearing sounds coming from behind that wall. Not the settling of old masonry, but something that sounded almost like conversation.
I activated my digital recorder and spoke clearly into the microphone. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, recording at Millbrook Station, October 15th, 11:47 p.m. I'm here to investigate reports of anomalous audio phenomena and to document any evidence of paranormal activity.
The words felt ridiculous spoken aloud, but I'd learned that proper documentation was essential for any serious investigation. If I was going to risk my academic reputation on ghost hunting, I'd do it with scientific rigor. The first anomaly occurred within minutes of beginning my investigation. As I walked the length of the main platform, testing the acoustics and noting the way sound carried in the misty air, my recorder picked up something I hadn't heard in real time. A faint whisper, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of dripping water and rustling leaves. I rewound the recording and listened again, adjusting the gain and filtering out the background noise. There it was, clear as daylight, a woman's voice, speaking what sounded like a name. Thomas, where are you?" My hands trembled as I saved the file and marked the timestamp. Rebecca hadn't mentioned hearing voices calling for Thomas, but the missing signalman's name couldn't be a coincidence. I forced myself to continue the investigation, documenting the station's layout and testing for electromagnetic anomalies, but my attention kept drifting to the sealed tunnel at the platform's eastern end. The brickwork was crude, utilitarian, nothing like the ornate masonry of the original station. Someone had been in a hurry to wall off whatever lay beyond. I pressed my ear to the cold surface and held my breath, straining to hear anything from the other side. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat.
Then, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, came the sound of footsteps echoing in a space that shouldn't exist.
I jerked back from the wall, my pulse racing. The rational part of my mind offered a dozen explanations. Water dripping through cracks in the masonry, the settling of old foundations, even animals that might have found their way into the sealed space through some hidden opening. But none of those explanations accounted for the rhythmic, deliberate nature of what I'd heard. I activated my EMF detector and swept it along the base of the wall. The readings spiked dramatically near the center of the sealed entrance, where the footsteps had seemed loudest. Either there was significant electrical interference coming from the tunnel, or something with its own electromagnetic signature was moving around in there. I was beginning to understand why Rebecca had sounded so shaken during our phone conversation. Millbrook Station wasn't just abandoned, it was actively haunted by something that wanted to be found. And whatever was behind that wall had been waiting 60 years for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. The rain had stopped, but the fog was growing thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards in any direction. As I prepared to investigate the station's interior, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows between the platforms, something that had been waiting a very long time for a visitor willing to hear its story. Chapter 2: The Weight of Silence. The station's main building loomed before me like a diseased tooth, its Victorian facade crumbling under decades of neglect. The heavy wooden door to the waiting room hung askew on rusted hinges, and as I pushed it open, the screech of protesting metal seemed to announce my presence to whatever dwelt in the darkness beyond. Inside, my flashlight beam cut through air thick with dust and the sweet smell of decay. Water damage had warped the floorboards into treacherous waves, and patches of black mold bloomed across the walls like cancerous flowers. But it was what I found on the ticket counter that made my blood run cold.
A child's wooden train, painted in faded red and blue, sat perfectly centered on the warped surface, as if someone had placed it there moments before my arrival. The paint was chipped and the wheels were missing, but there was no dust on it. None at all. Everything else in the room wore a thick coating of grime, yet this toy looked as though it had been lovingly maintained.
I photographed it from every angle, then carefully lifted it to examine the bottom. Carved into the wood in a child's unsteady hand were the initials TM and a date, Christmas 1962. Thomas Mitchell, it had to be. But according to Rebecca's research, the signalman had vanished in 1963, and he'd been a bachelor with no family. I was still puzzling over this contradiction when my EMF detector began chirping frantically. The readings were off the charts, far beyond anything that could be explained by residual electrical systems. I swept the device in a slow arc, following the signal's strongest point toward the back of the waiting room. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I approached a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. The brass nameplate below it read, T. Mitchell, Station Master. My hand froze on the doorknob. Station Master? Rebecca had said Thomas was a signalman, but this suggested he'd held a much more senior position. How many other details had been lost or deliberately obscured over the decades? I turned the handle, expecting resistance, but the door swung open smoothly on well-oiled hinges. Someone had been maintaining this room. Thomas Mitchell's office was a shrine to a life interrupted. His desk calendar still showed January 1963, with several appointments penciled in for dates he would never keep. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside a stack of railway timetables, a skin of mold floating on its surface like a miniature oil slick. But it was the wall that truly unsettled me.
Dozens of photographs covered every available inch of space. Not official railway documentation, but personal snapshots of children. Boys and girls ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12, all smiling at the camera with the innocent joy of childhood. Some were posed formally in their Sunday best, others caught in candid moments of play. At the center of this gallery hung a larger portrait, a young boy with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing a conductor's cap that was far too big for his head.
The resemblance to the carved initials on the toy train couldn't be coincidental. But if Thomas Mitchell had no family, who was this child? And why had he surrounded himself with pictures of children he supposedly didn't know?
I was documenting the photographs when I heard it. the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. It was joyful, unguarded, the kind of carefree sound that belonged to summer afternoons and birthday parties, not to this tomb of rotting wood and forgotten dreams.
"Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with sudden emotion. "Is someone there?"
The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. But in that silence, I could feel a presence, not malevolent, but desperately lonely. Something that had been waiting in this place for 60 years, hoping someone would finally understand. I thought of the sealed tunnel, of the voices calling Thomas's name, of this office maintained as if its occupant might return at any moment. A terrible possibility was beginning to take shape in my mind, one that made the official story of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance seem like a carefully constructed lie. My hands shook as I examined the desk more closely. Hidden beneath the railway timetables, I found a leather journal bound with a piece of string. The entries were written in a careful, precise hand that gradually devolved into frantic scrawling as the dates approached January 1963.
"The dreams are getting worse," read one entry dated 3 days before Thomas's disappearance. "I see their faces every night, all the children who never made it home. They're calling to me from the tunnel, begging me to join them. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just walk into the darkness and let it take me too."
The journal slipped from my numb fingers and hit the floor with a sound like breaking bones. The children in the photographs weren't Thomas's family. They were victims, and he hadn't disappeared at all. He had walked into that tunnel willingly, carrying the weight of some unspeakable guilt, seeking the only absolution he thought he deserved. The laughter I'd heard wasn't the echo of joy, it was the sound of innocence calling to the man who had failed to protect it. As I gathered my equipment and prepared to leave the office, one final photograph caught my eye. It had fallen from behind the others, as if it had been deliberately hidden. The image showed Thomas Mitchell himself, but not as the haunted man I was beginning to understand. This was Thomas as a child, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside a woman who could only be his mother. Both were smiling, but there was something wrong with the boy's eyes, a darkness that didn't belong in such a young face. On the back, someone had written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen in the journal, "Before I knew what I would become." I tucked the photograph into my jacket pocket and headed for the door, but as I reached the threshold, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere deep in the building came the sound of a door closing, followed by the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone walking through the corridors I had just explored.
Thomas Mitchell was still here, still walking the halls of his abandoned kingdom, still searching for a forgiveness that would never come.
And he knew I had found his secret. Chapter 3, The Weight of Truth. The footsteps weren't mine. I stood frozen in the doorway of Thomas Mitchell's office, my hand still gripping the photograph that had revealed his terrible secret. The sound echoed through the abandoned station with deliberate precision, heel, toe, like someone intimately familiar with every creaking board and loose tile in the building. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Another urban explorer, perhaps, a security guard making rounds, but deep in my gut, I knew better. Those weren't the footsteps of someone discovering this place for the first time. They belonged to someone who had walked these halls for decades. I forced myself to move, stepping back into the office and quietly closing the door. Through the grimy window, I could see the platform where I'd first heard the children's laughter. The fog had thickened, turning the station into a maze of half-glimpsed shadows and distorted shapes. But the footsteps were getting closer.
They paused directly outside the office door.
For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the broken windows and the steady drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. Then came a new sound, the soft scrape of fingernails against wood, as if someone was running their hand along the doorframe. I thought about the journal entries I'd read, about Thomas Mitchell's descent into madness and guilt. Whatever had driven him into that sealed tunnel 60 years ago was still here, still searching, still hungry for something I couldn't understand. The door handle began to turn.
I pressed myself against the far wall, my camera forgotten, my recorder still running but clutched uselessly in my sweating palm. The door opened with a soft creak, and a figure stepped into the room.
At first, I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the fog and failing light. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shape of a man in a railway uniform that belonged to another era. His face was pale and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Thomas Mitchell, 60 years dead, but still walking his beat, still carrying the weight of whatever sins had driven him to seek oblivion in that dark tunnel.
"You shouldn't have come here," he said, and his voice was like the whisper of wind through dry leaves. "You shouldn't have found those things."
I wanted to run, but something in his tone held me frozen. This wasn't the malevolent spirit I'd expected. This was a broken man, trapped by his own guilt and unable to find peace. "What happened to the children?" I managed to whisper, the words scraping my throat raw.
Thomas's ghostly form flickered like a candle flame. "I was supposed to protect them," he said, his voice growing stronger but no less haunted. "The station master's first duty is to keep the passengers safe, but I failed them, all of them."
He moved closer, and I could smell the phantom scent of coal smoke and machine oil that clung to him like a shroud. "There was an accident," he continued. "A school trip, returning from the coast. The signal failed. I should have seen it, should have stopped the train before." His words trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. A collision, children killed, a tragedy that had been covered up or forgotten by everyone except the man responsible for preventing it.
"Their voices follow me," Thomas said, his form becoming more solid, more real. "Every night they call my name. They want to know why I let them die."
I understood now why he had walked into the tunnel. Not to hide from justice, but to join the children he had failed to save. But death hadn't brought him the peace he sought. Instead, it had trapped him here, reliving his guilt for eternity.
"The tunnel," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They're in the tunnel, aren't they? The children?"
Thomas laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. "You think I sealed it to hide evidence? No, I sealed it to keep them in, to keep their voices from spreading through the entire station. But it doesn't work. Nothing works."
The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Through the walls, I could hear them now, the children's voices, calling out in a language of innocence and loss that transcended death itself. But there was something else in their voices now, something I hadn't heard before. Not just sadness, but forgiveness. They weren't calling for vengeance. They were calling for Thomas to finally let go.
"They forgive you," I said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Can't you hear it? They're not angry. They just want you to stop carrying this alone."
Thomas's form wavered, and for a moment I thought he might simply fade away. But then he looked at me with eyes that held 60 years of accumulated sorrow, and I realized that forgiveness, even from the dead, wasn't always enough to break the chains we forge for ourselves.
"Some sins are too heavy to put down," he said, and began to walk toward the door. "Some echoes never fade."
As he disappeared into the corridor, his footsteps fading into the distance, I understood that my investigation was far from over. The truth about Thomas Mitchell was only the beginning. Somewhere in this station, in that sealed tunnel, the real story was waiting to be uncovered. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I knew I would be back. Chapter 4. The Weight of Truth. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to return to Millbrook Station. 3 days of restless sleep, plagued by the echo of children's voices and the image of Thomas Mitchell's haunted eyes. But the recorder in my equipment bag called to me like a siren song, its memory filled with evidence that demanded investigation. I had done my research this time, hours spent in the local library's archives, digging through newspaper microfiche and railway commission reports from 1963. The official story was sanitized, clinical. Signal malfunction results in collision between passenger and freight trains. 14 casualties, including 12 children from St. Mary's Primary School returning from educational excursion to Whitby. What the reports didn't mention was that the signalman, Thomas Mitchell, had disappeared the same night. His body was found 3 weeks later in the sealed tunnel, ruled a suicide by a coroner eager to close an embarrassing case. The railway company had quietly settled with the families, and the station had been shuttered within the year.
14 dead, I muttered as I approached the station entrance, my flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. 12 children and 2 adults, all because one man couldn't live with his mistake.
But as I pushed open the station door, something felt different. The air was heavier, more oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My equipment registered immediate temperature fluctuations, not the gradual drop I'd experienced before, but rapid spikes and valleys that made no meteorological sense. I made my way to the signal box, following the same route Thomas had taken 60 years ago on his final night of duty. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step echoing through the empty building like a countdown. At the top, I found his logbook still open on the desk, its pages yellowed and brittle.
The final entry was dated September 23, 1963. Evening service delayed, signal lamp flickering platform 2, must investigate after freight passage. Below that, in a different hand, shakier, more desperate, were words that hadn't been there 3 days ago. They're coming back, all of them. I can hear the train.
My blood ran cold. I had photographed this logbook during my first visit. Those final lines hadn't existed then. Someone or something had been writing in a 60-year-old book.
I set up my equipment with trembling hands, positioning cameras at multiple angles, while my EMF detector screamed warnings about electromagnetic disturbances. The digital recorder picked up ambient sound immediately, not just the usual settling of old wood and metal, but something rhythmic, purposeful.
Thomas? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, are you here? I know about the children. I know what really happened that night.
The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and irregular. Then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. Not the gradual chill I'd felt before, but a plummeting descent that turned my breath to vapor in seconds. He materialized gradually this time, first as a shadow in my peripheral vision, then as a more solid presence standing beside the signal levers. Thomas Mitchell looked exactly as he had in life. Middle-aged, wearing his railway uniform, but his eyes held the weight of decades spent in purgatory.
You shouldn't have come back, he said, his voice carrying across the small room like a cold wind. Some stories are meant to stay buried.
But they're not buried, are they? I replied, surprising myself with my steadiness. The children, the guilt, the truth, none of it is buried. It's all still here, still happening, night after night.
Thomas's form flickered, and for a moment I saw not the tired signalman but something else, something twisted by 6 decades of self-imposed torment. You think you understand? He snarled. You think reading newspaper clippings makes you an expert on damnation?
The signal levers began moving on their own, clicking into positions with mechanical precision. The phantom freight train was coming, right on schedule, carrying its cargo of guilt and regret through a station that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. Show me, I said, stepping closer despite every survival instinct screaming retreat. Show me what really happened that night. Let me help you tell the truth.
Thomas stared at me for a long moment, his form solidifying until he looked almost human, almost alive. The truth, he whispered. The truth is that I was drunk. The truth is that I fell asleep at my post. The truth is that 12 children died because I couldn't stay awake for one goddamn shift.
His confession hung in the air between us like a physical thing, heavy with the weight of 60 years' worth of suppressed honesty. This was what he had never been able to tell anyone. Not the investigators, not the families, not even himself, until this moment. And you've been punishing yourself ever since, I said, understanding flooding through me. But Thomas, staying here, reliving it over and over, it doesn't bring them back. It doesn't change what happened.
Then what does? He demanded, his voice breaking. What possible purpose could there be in moving on? Those children trusted the railway. They trusted me to keep them safe.
And in that moment, I realized why I had been drawn to this place, why the voices had called to me through my equipment. Not to expose a cover-up or solve a mystery, but to bear witness to a man's final confession and help him understand that even the heaviest guilt could be set down. The purpose, I said quietly, is that someone finally knows the whole truth. Someone can tell their story properly, all of their stories.
Thomas looked at me with something approaching hope for the first time since his death. Will you? He asked. Will you tell it right?
Every word, I promised, and meant it. As the first hints of dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, Thomas Mitchell smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 60 years. Then he faded away, not with the violent dissolution I'd witnessed before, but with the gentle passing of someone finally ready to rest. But I knew my work here was far from finished. The children's voices still echoed from the sealed tunnel, and their story, their truth, remained untold. Chapter 5. The Children's Choir. The silence that followed Thomas's departure felt different, expectant, like the pause before a symphony's final movement. I stood alone on the platform, my equipment still humming with residual energy, when I heard it, the faintest whisper of children's laughter echoing from the sealed tunnel. This was why I'd come here. Not just for Thomas's confession, but for the 12 young voices that had been crying out for someone to listen, someone to remember their names instead of just their tragedy. I approached the tunnel entrance, its bricked-up mouth now seeming less like a barrier and more like a wound that had never properly healed. The mortar between the bricks was crumbling in places, and through the gaps, I could feel the whisper of air that shouldn't exist in a sealed space.
"Hello?" I called softly, pressing my ear to the cold brick. "I know you're there. Thomas told me what happened. He told me the truth."
The response came not as words, but as images flooding my mind, sudden, vivid, overwhelming. I saw the school excursion train from their perspective, excitement at their first railway journey, sticky fingers pressed against windows, the conductor's kind smile as he punched their tickets. Then came the moment of impact. Not the violent crash the newspapers had described, but something far more insidious. The train simply stopped existing in the normal flow of time. One moment they were laughing about the countryside rushing past, the next they were suspended in an endless present where the journey never ended. "You've been trapped here," I said aloud, understanding washing over me like cold water. Not just dead, caught between moments, between the last second of life and whatever comes after.
A child's voice, clear as crystal, spoke from beyond the bricks. The nice man fell asleep. We tried to wake him up, but he couldn't hear us anymore.
More voices joined in, a choir of the innocent describing their final moments with the matter-of-fact acceptance that only children possess. They spoke of the train slowing, of the strange shimmer in the air, of how they'd called out to Thomas, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. "What are your names?" I asked, pulling out my notebook with shaking hands. "Tell me your names, all of them."
"I'm Margaret," came the first response, bright and eager. "Margaret Holloway. I was going to be a teacher when I grew up." "Timothy Walsh," announced another voice, proud and clear. "I collected train tickets. I had 47 different ones."
One by one, they told me their names, their ages, their dreams cut short. Sarah Chen, who wanted to be a nurse. Peter Morrison, who loved mathematics. The Hartwell twins, Emma and James, inseparable even in death. Each name was a small revelation, a piece of humanity rescued from the anonymity of newspaper headlines. As I wrote, I felt their presence growing stronger, more solid. They weren't malevolent spirits trapped by anger. They were children who had simply never been properly acknowledged, never been seen as individuals rather than statistics in a tragic headline.
"We've been waiting such a long time," said a small voice that introduced itself as Lucy Pemberton, age 7. "We knew someone would come who could hear us properly. Thomas tried, but he was too sad to listen."
The temperature around me dropped suddenly, and I realized we weren't alone. Other presences pressed close, not the children, but something else entirely. The railway's guilt had attracted more than just the direct victims of that night's tragedy. Shadows began moving along the platform, shapes that might once have been people, but were now stretched thin by decades of feeding on regret and sorrow. These were the parasites that had grown fat on Thomas's self-torment, entities that thrived on unresolved guilt.
"Stay back," I called out, though I wasn't sure if I was addressing the shadow things or warning the children. "This isn't about you anymore."
But the children's voices rose in unison, no longer small or frightened. Together, they formed a chorus of pure intention, their combined will pushing back against the encroaching darkness. For the first time in 60 years, they were acting as one, not as victims, but as guardians of their own story.
"We don't need to be afraid anymore," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone far older than her 13 years. "We have our names back, We have someone who knows who we were.
The shadow things recoiled, their forms beginning to dissolve like smoke in sunlight. Without Thomas's guilt to anchor them, without the children's fear to feed on, they had no power here. As the first drops of rain began to fall through the station's broken roof, I felt a shift in the air itself. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on this place for 6 decades was lifting, carried away by the simple act of acknowledgement.
Will you tell everyone? Timothy asked, his voice already beginning to fade. Will you make sure they know we were real people, not just numbers in a report?
Every single one of you, I promised, clutching my notebook tight. The world will know your names, your dreams, your stories. I swear it. One by one, their voices faded into peaceful silence. Not the hollow quiet of abandonment, but the gentle hush of a story finally told. The children of the 1947 disaster were moving on at last, their names and memories safe in the hands of someone who would honor them properly. I walked back through the station toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing differently now, lighter somehow, as if the building itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for 60 years. The rain was falling harder, washing the dust from broken windows and giving everything the clean scent of renewal. But as I reached the platform's edge, I heard something that made me stop cold, the distant sound of a train whistle, carried on the wind from somewhere far down the tracks. Not the phantom freight that Thomas had conjured from his guilt, but something else entirely. Something that suggested this night's revelations were only the beginning. Chapter 6. The Weight of Truth. The whistle came again, clearer this time. Not the mournful wail of Thomas's phantom freight, but something sharper, more immediate. I froze at the platform's edge, rain streaming down my face as I strained to listen through the storm. This wasn't supposed to happen. The children were at peace. The shadows had dissolved. The station's curse was broken, so why did every instinct I possessed scream that something far worse was approaching? I fumbled for my recorder, hands shaking as I pressed the button. The device had captured everything so far. The voices, the revelations, the moment of resolution. But now the LED display flickered erratically, as if struggling against some new interference.
Hello? I called into the darkness beyond the platform. Is someone there?
Footsteps answered, heavy, deliberate, coming from the direction of the sealed tunnel. Not the light patter of children's shoes or the measured gait of a railway worker, but something that spoke of authority, of ownership. Someone who belonged here in ways that went deeper than death.
I should have run. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to flee while I still could. But the journalist in me, the part that had driven me to seek out this story in the first place, kept me rooted to the spot.
You think you've solved something. The voice that emerged from the tunnel's mouth was cultured, precise, the accent of someone educated in an earlier era. You think your little seance has cleansed this place of its sins.
A figure stepped into the pale moonlight filtering through the station's broken roof. Tall, impeccably dressed despite the decay around us, wearing a station master's uniform that looked as crisp as the day it was tailored. His face was sharp-featured, handsome in the way of men from old photographs, but his eyes held something that made my blood freeze. This wasn't a victim like the children, or a tormented soul like Thomas. This was something else entirely, something that had orchestrated the tragedy rather than suffered from it.
Station Master Whitmore, I said, the name coming to me from some half-remembered newspaper clipping. You were supposed to be off duty that night. The inquiry cleared you of any wrongdoing.
His smile was thin as a razor blade. Off duty, yes? Innocent? He laughed, the sound echoing off the station walls like breaking glass. I wonder what gave you that impression.
Those children were so trusting, he continued, stepping closer, so eager to believe that the nice man in the uniform would keep them safe. Even when I told them the platform was clear, even when I waved that freight train through.
The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The signal failure that night hadn't been mechanical, it had been deliberate. Whitmore had orchestrated the entire disaster, sacrificing those children for reasons I couldn't yet fathom.
You murdered them, I breathed. All of them, but why?
His expression shifted, revealing something ancient and hungry beneath the civilized veneer. You wouldn't understand. You modern people, with your psychology and your rational explanations, You think evil is something that can be explained away, categorized, filed under trauma and mental illness.
Some of us simply enjoy the work, he said with mock pleasantness. Some of us have been practicing it far longer than your precious children have been dead.
I backed away, but he matched my movements step for step, herding me toward the platform's center. The rain was falling harder now, turning the already treacherous surface slick and dangerous.
The children found peace tonight, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They're beyond your reach now. Oh, my dear naive little truth seeker, Whitmore chuckled. Did you really think it was that simple? That a few kind words and some emotional catharsis would undo 60 years of careful cultivation?
He gestured to the station around us, and I realized with growing horror that the oppressive atmosphere hadn't lifted at all. It had merely shifted. The children's fear was gone, yes, but something else had taken its place. Something darker, more purposeful. I've been feeding on their terror for decades, he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. Their anguish, their confusion, their desperate need to be remembered. But you've given me something far more valuable. You've given me hope.
And hope, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, hope tastes so much sweeter when it's torn away.
I understood then that I had been played from the very beginning. Every revelation, every moment of connection with the children, every step towards solving the mystery, it had all been orchestrated. Whitmore had been guiding me, using my desire to help as a weapon against the very souls I'd tried to save. But as that realization hit me, something else crystallized in my mind. The children hadn't just found peace, they had found strength. And in telling their stories, in giving them names and voices again, I had given them something Whitmore couldn't control: agency.
Margaret, I called out into the storm. Timothy, Sarah, all of you, he's still here. He's the one who...
The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The rain around us began to slow, then stopped altogether, as if time itself was holding its breath.
You cannot summon them, Whitmore snarled, his composed facade cracking. They are at rest, they are beyond.
We never left. Margaret's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, joined by the others in a chorus that made the station walls vibrate. They weren't the frightened children of an hour ago. They were something new, something that had found power in truth and purpose in justice.
You made us afraid for so long, Timothy's voice added, but she helped us remember who we were before you stole our lives.
The rain began to fall again, but now it felt like tears, not of sorrow, but of release. Whitmore's perfectly pressed uniform began to fade, his sharp features blurring as the children's combined will pressed against him.
This isn't over, he hissed as his form wavered. There are others, other stations, other tragedies. You think one small victory matters?
I pulled out my notebook, water-stained but intact, and met his fading eyes.
It matters to them, I said, and it matters to every soul you've used.
Whitmore's outline convulsed, flickering like an old film reel at the end of its spool. The air around us shimmered with light, no longer the oppressive gray of decay, but the amber glow of morning. His hat fell first, dissolving into mist before it touched the platform. Then his face, his smirk, peeled away like smoke in sunlight.
You can't silence me, he howled, voice fracturing into static. The line is long, the line never ends.
And then he was gone, not exorcised, not banished, just gone. Whatever dark current had fed him had finally run dry. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, alive, with the sound of soft rain striking the iron canopy, washing away 60 years of corrosion and sorrow. The air tasted clean for the first time. I lowered my recorder, its red light blinking steadily, and whispered the closing entry.
Millbrook Station, 5:42 a.m. The echoes are quiet now. The children's names are known. The truth of the line has been spoken.
I walked the length of the platform one last time, past the rusted benches and the crumbling signal box, until I reached the spot where the fog had first swallowed me days earlier. The mist was thinner now, revealing the first gold streaks of dawn stretching across the rails. I promised the children I'd tell their story, and I would. Not in a ghost forum or an academic journal, but properly, in print, with every name, every face, every dream they'd shared through the wall. But as I reached the station gate, I heard it again.
A single distant train horn echoing through the valley, not mournful this time, calling, inviting.
I turned back. For a heartbeat, I saw figures on the platform, small, translucent silhouettes waving goodbye. Then the fog reclaimed them. They were free at last. I started down the road toward my car, rain on my hood, notebook under my arm. The recorder still blinked in my pocket. But as I reached the bridge over the tracks, the device crackled to life by itself.
A voice, not a child's this time. Not Thomas, not Whitmore, whispered through the static. It's not the only station.
I stopped walking. The fog along the tracks seemed to shift, hinting at shapes, platform signs, signals, silhouettes, stretching into the horizon far beyond sight. Maybe Whitmore had been telling the truth. Maybe Millbrook wasn't unique. Somewhere out there, other lines still hummed with the same forgotten electricity. Other stations carrying the weight of stories no one had dared to finish.
Then I'll find them, I said quietly. Every last one.
The sound of an unseen engine rumbled deep beneath the earth as I turned away, heading into the dawn. The echoes of Millbrook Station were fading behind me, but ahead, the tracks waited, and I intended to follow them wherever they led. The end. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, ring the bell, and tell your friends about my listening library.